Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Examining the State Budget, the Senate's Proposal. I'm Anne Marie French, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based in Concord. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. We are delighted to have so many attendees from all across the state joining us today. Our featured presenter is NHFPI Senior Policy Analyst Phil Slatton. Phil is NHFPI's lead analyst for budget and revenue. Prior to joining NHFPI in 2016, Phil served for 3 years as a performance auditor for the Office of Legislative Budget Assistant, and he has accumulated a vast knowledge of the state budget and the range of funding sources that support it. Following Phil's presentation, NHFPI policy analyst Michael Palazzati will join Phil on screen to facilitate a question and answer session. We encourage you to use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen, to submit questions during the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post the recording and the presentation slide deck to our website following the event. We'll share the links and other related resources with you via email as well following the event. And as we know, it can be a challenge to see the tiny numbers on these slides. We've posted the slide deck to our website, and that link will be shared with you via the chat, so you can follow along on another device to follow along more easily. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Phil to begin the presentation. Over to you, Phil.
Right. Thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I want to talk to you today about the state Senate's budget proposal. But before we get into the details, I also want to make sure that everyone has a baseline understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about the New Hampshire state budget. So the New Hampshire budget is a 2-year or biennial operating budget. That's what we're referring to when we're referring to the state budget. It funds most state operations. Not all state operations are funded through the state budget. For example, the capital budget is a 6-year budget and can borrow funds for capital projects, whereas the state's 2-year operating budget is based on revenues that that come in during the budget biennium and savings that are brought into the budget biennium as well. And it funds state operations for 2 state fiscal years. And those state fiscal years begin on July 1st. So the next state budget will provide funding for state fiscal years 2022 and 2023, which in calendar year terms starts at the beginning of next month, July 1st of 2021, and lasts through June 30th of 2023. Now, the state budget is comprised, when we're referring to the state budget, we're actually talking about 2 separate pieces of legislation. The first is the operating budget bill, which is typically referred to House Bill 1 or HB 1. It includes the items that you might imagine when you're imagining a state budget. There are agencies that have line items underneath them for various appropriations and dollars associated with each of those line items. There is text included in House Bill 1 as well, typically referred to as the back of House Bill 1. And that text, it follows the roughly 700 pages of line item appropriations and is just a little under 10 pages at the end, which again deals with just appropriations and expenditures. Now, the trailer bill is typically called House Bill 2 or HB 2, and it moves through the process with House Bill 1, with the state's operating budget document. And the trailer bill is a policy bill and includes the policy language that is often associated with setting up new programs that might be funded through House Bill 1, but the language describing those programs or establishing those programs isn't included in House Bill 1 because that just includes the line items. So House Bill 2 includes that policy language, can make separate appropriations. So not only can it support and help elucidate more about the appropriations that are in House Bill 1. It can also make appropriations itself in House Bill 2 separately from House Bill 1. And House Bill 2, it can include legislation on any topic, right? It is a separate bill, an omnibus policy bill. Now, where we are in the process now is the Senate has just finished considering the budget in its phase of the budget. So the budget process is actually a year-long process. It starts when state agencies are submitting their requests, developing and submitting their requests to the governor's office. Then the governor will present, in this case, his budget proposal to the legislature, and that will be introduced into the House in the form of House Bill 1 and House Bill 2. The House makes their modifications and votes on their budget proposal. It then goes to the Senate. The Senate then makes the changes that it sees fit and votes on its budget proposal. That happened Thursday of last week. And where we are in the process now is that Senate version of the budget has gone back to the House for consideration. The House can concur with the changes made to the Senate, in which Senate version of the budget. In which case the Senate's version of the budget will go to the governor's desk for consideration. If the House does not concur, then the budget will go to a committee of conference formed by House and Senate members, who will then put together a final version of the state budget as proposed by the legislature that will then have to pass through both chambers before going to the governor's desk for consideration. So in this presentation, we will be focusing on the changes that the Senate made to the House's version of the state budget. And we'll talk about those changes in a couple different steps. We'll start with health and social services. As you can see in the pie chart on the right, health and social services is the largest appropriations area of the 6 categories that include all state budget appropriations. It's the largest appropriations area in the state budget. That is not unusual that that's the case in the Senate budget. It has been in past budgets as well. Education is the next largest area, so we'll focus there, and then talk about the balance of the other budget areas after we focus on those 2 areas. Then we'll talk about revenue and revenue changes and revenue projections and the policy changes that affect those revenues, and then compare the top line numbers across the budget proposals and how do the total amounts appropriated compare. And then we'll end the presentation by talking a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act and what the impacts are on state finances from the American Rescue Plan Act and how that may fund services going forward as well. Now, because we're focusing just on the changes, but from the Senate that the Senate made to the House's version of the budget as the Senate received it from the House, we're only going to cover those changes in detail, but obviously there have been other changes that have been made in prior iterations of the budget relative to the current state budget as enacted, the one the state is operating with now. So you can learn more about the changes that the governor proposed relative to the budget as currently enacted and the House budget proposed relative to the governor's budget in other NHFPI resources and presentations. And that includes issue briefs that we've published on the governor's budget proposal and the House's budget proposal. We also published an issue brief about, prior to these budget proposals being released, about ways in which the state could design a budget to meet the needs of New Hampshire residents during and after the COVID-19 crisis as we recover from the crisis. This is also the 3rd in our series of 3 webinars on the state budget during this legislative session. The first one focused on the governor's proposal, and the second one focused on the House Finance Committee's proposal, which then became the House's proposal without any amendments. You can find all those resources on our website at nhfpi.org. And it's important also to remember the context for this state budget process, which is relatively unique. We're in what you may call an unsettled economic and public health environment. In both cases, the indicators are trending very positive as of late, which is a great sign. However, it's been a very dynamic 6 months. A lot has changed, and a lot could still change. We don't exactly know what this recovery is going to look like on either the economic or the public health front. And it's important to remember that economic situations for many Granite Staters remain relatively difficult. In the most recent data that we have from the US Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, which was designed by the Census Bureau to provide high frequency, closer to real-time understanding of how households and individuals are faring during the pandemic. About 1 in 5 New Hampshire adults reported it was difficult, or somewhat or very difficult to pay for usual household expenses in the most recent data that we have, which is as of mid and late May. Now, we don't have an exact number to compare that to relative to prior to the pandemic because this survey didn't exist before the pandemic. But considering these are usual household expenses and 1 in 5 adults are reporting difficulty paying for them, suggests there's still quite a bit of economic hardship out there resulting from the pandemic. And we know from other data that the negative economic impacts of the crisis have been most severe on the individuals and groups that have had the fewest resources going into this crisis. That's not a surprise for a recession, but it has been particularly acute during this particular crisis. And employment in low-wage work that we've seen in New Hampshire and across the country has been impacted much more deeply and persistently than middle and high-wage work. So again, that suggests that the economic impacts have been hardest on those who have the fewest resources. Now, there have been federal actions as well as state actions to support residents in the state, and state revenues can also help support services going forward as well. The American Rescue Plan Act has improved the economic outlook overall since that was passed in March. And state revenues continue to be strong and actually have generated a significant budget surplus during this budget biennium. And that's even including the initial negative shock to state revenues that we saw as a result of the COVID-19 crisis at the initial onset of the pandemic. Now let's focus on that largest slice of the pie, of the largest of the 6 categories in terms of appropriations, which is health and social services. Now, the health and social services category is largely the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, although not entirely, that's most of it. And the Senate made some key changes to the DHHS budget relative to the House. The House had proposed including a $50 million back of the budget reduction in general funds, so a $50 million reduction in general funds sort of across all the budget lines of DHHS. The Senate removed that provision, so that $50 million reduction is no longer included. However, the Senate did keep the back of the budget reduction of $22.6 million in general funds that was specifically tied to positions. The House estimated that the House included this provision and estimated that about 226 positions would be eliminated as a result, and capped the DHHS at 3,000 full-time positions during the biennium. That's a provision that the Senate retained. The Senate also voted to make changes to the DHHS budget that reduced appropriations primarily by reducing Medicaid matching funds, both moving some off budget and also reducing the amount of caseloads that were projected. That's new caseload projections came forward, and those reductions led to reductions overall, especially in Medicaids and on the federal side as well. And there were some federal match change assumptions too that were different, and there were services as well that didn't happen during the budget biennium because of social distancing restrictions or concerns around spreading the virus. So the Senate actually took some of those funds that would have otherwise lapsed to the general fund, that would have otherwise been gone to general fund surplus, and dedicated them for specific purposes in the DHHS budget. So allowing some of those funds to be carried forward into the next budget biennium. The Senate would also close the Sununu Youth Services Center. This is a little bit of a different timeline than the House. The Senate set the closure date at no later than March 1st of 2023. And the Senate would also establish a committee to develop the closure and replacement plans for the center and help ensure that the children that are at the Sununu Youth Services Center are transitioned into appropriate settings as well. Again, a little bit of a different setup than the House. This provision was changed relative to the House proposal, but the House also voted to close the Sununu Youth Services Center. The Senate also added a $30 million appropriation from State Fiscal Year 2021 surplus funds to construct a 24-bed forensic psychiatric hospital. This is on the top of an appropriation that was made in the last budget for the construction of this facility on the grounds of New Hampshire Hospital. The cost estimates from the Department of Administrative Services went up, so this is an additional appropriation for that. This facility would house folks, including folks who are currently, likely the folks who are currently at the secure psychiatric unit in the state prison. There's also $6 million for new transitional housing beds and enhanced reimbursement rates for behavioral health patients, and a total across 2 different budget lines of $8.2 million for community mental health through system of care and through stabilization services, pardon me. There's also funds for a dental benefit for Medicaid adults, so adults age 21 and older in Medicaid. That dental benefit would start no later than January of 2023 and is funded in the 2nd year of the biennium. So those are some of the key changes at the Department of Health and Human Services. We'll talk about some other ones, but I did want to talk about the overall funding level at the DHHS as well. So here you can see all the way over on the left, in the darkest blue is the authorized adjusted amount of the current funding levels, if you will, or as of the beginning of the governor's phase of the budget process at the Department of Health and Human Services. You can also see what the department requested in that 2nd column. That is the lighter bluish green shade and includes the dark green at the top, which is the additional prioritized needs amount. Everything below that is the efficiency budget request. I should also note the vertical axis on this graph doesn't start at 0, so this is zoomed in to show you the changes between the different levels. So that shows what the agency requested at the beginning of the budget process. The governor's proposal is that middle column in green. That's what came out with the governor's proposed budget on February 11th. The House proposal from the House version of the budget is in orange, and you can see that's the lowest of these bars here. The Senate did partially restore funding at the Department of Health and Human Services across its the House Bill 1 and House Bill 2 appropriations that the Senate made. Now, one of the places where the Senate did add a fair bit of funding was in relative to long-term care and Medicaid reimbursement rates relative to long-term care. The Senate proposed adding about $21.4 million to increase funding for nursing homes by 5%. And this would use general fund and federal matching funds, so federal Medicaid funds. It wouldn't require any new funding from counties to meet that 5%. Counties have some obligation under current state statute to provide funding to support Medicaid patients in nursing homes and receiving home and community-based services or similar home and community-based services for residents who are residents of their counties. This appropriation would not require any more of counties for this 5% increase. The Senate also voted to include at least a 5% increase for most services, not all services, but most services for the Choices for Independence Medicaid waiver program. And this is a program that's designed to provide home and community-based services that's really an alternative to nursing home care, providing assistance to people in their homes as opposed to having them go to a nursing home to receive this care. There are some services under the CFI waiver program that would have received a more than 5% rate increase. This provision was adjusted so that at least 5% for most services, there would be at least a 5% increase, but would be larger increases for some. There's also a provision that establishes a committee to study parity in reimbursement rates between Medicaid waiver programs. There's a 5% increase in Medicaid reimbursement rates to skilled nursing facilities and facilities providing intermediate care to people with intellectual disabilities. And there's a $4 million appropriation, including $2 million from the general fund for adult medical day services. One of the appropriations also that the Senate made, which is preventing dollars from lapsing in state fiscal year 2021, is moving $11 million for some of these services that was unspent and would have lapsed to the general fund at the end of 2021. Pulling that forward into 2022 is another high dollar value change that the Senate made. Now, when we're considering housing services and people experiencing homelessness, services for people experiencing homelessness, not all of these services are included in the health and social services category of the state budget. However, I've included them all on one slide here for convenience, so we can look at these housing related services together in one place. There's an addition of $3 million for funding shelter programs at the DHHS. Again, I'm focusing on those who are experiencing homelessness. And there's also a one-time appropriation of $25 million to the Affordable Housing Fund that's administered by the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. The Senate also considered suspending the additional $5 million per year that goes to the Affordable Housing Fund from real estate transfer tax revenues. The Senate decided to that's a provision that was established just in the last budget, so it's a relatively new provision. The Senate decided to maintain that $5 million per year appropriation. So in total, there'd be a $35 million appropriation in this budget to the Affordable Housing Fund. Just $25 million of it is a one-time appropriation. And the Senate also added funding to the operational budget for the Housing Appeals Board. There was concern that it was too low to fulfill its intended purpose. Now, there are other changes in health and social services as well. One is that the Senate restored the Family Medical Leave Insurance Plan with a minor change that had been proposed initially by the governor. The House had removed this plan. This plan would base a pool of family medical leave insurance based on the state employees who would be required to participate, and then other individuals and businesses could opt to participate. The House removed this provision. The Senate has added it back in again with a minor change. The Senate also voted to add $3 million, including both federal and state funds for additional Medicaid home visiting services, and $3 million just in state funds for child care services for families that had previously been engaged in preventive or protective services from the DHHS Division of Children, Youth, and Families. When those cases are closed, these dollars are used to provide child care for these families. There's also an additional 10 child protective service worker positions that were funded. There was some consideration of funding an additional 22 positions. The Senate decided to fund 10 of those positions and provide an option to the department, if it fills those positions, to go to the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee and request funding for the additional 12 positions. There's also an appropriation for youth tobacco prevention and outreach, and a $150,000 appropriation to establish an incentive program, a dollar for dollar match in the food stamp program in New Hampshire, also known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP as it's known nationally, that would provide the matching dollars specifically for fresh fruits and vegetables, with an emphasis on those that are grown locally. And the Senate also voted to remove a separation that the House had included in its version of the budget that would have required family planning services to be both physically and financially separate from entities that provide abortion services. However, the Senate also did, while it removed that provision, it added in a separate provision related that would prohibit healthcare providers from performing abortions 24 weeks or longer after the pregnancy began, with verification and reporting requirements, exceptions for substantial physical health impacts on the mother, and criminal penalties for violating the provision. So now we've covered a lot of ground in health and social services, but I want to move on to the next largest slice of the pie, which is education. And there were some quite significant changes to education funding as well in the Senate's version of the state budget. It's important to remember when we're talking about education funding, as in state funding that goes to local public school districts, enrollment is a key factor in determining how many dollars are flowing from the state to local governments to fund local public education. Enrollment has been declining in New Hampshire since the 2002-2003 school year in aggregate. That's not necessarily true for every district, but it's true in aggregate. Enrollment declined faster, or more steeply, I should say, during the pandemic. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen with enrollment in a post-pandemic world, if you will. But those enrollment projections are key, and the Department of Education has projected a continued decline in enrollment. And it's because so much of the funding is on a per pupil basis, that does affect the aggregate numbers quite a bit. Now, the Senate budget would add up to $17.5 million per year for additional targeted funding that's based on free and reduced price school meal eligibility. This is built on a sliding scale where communities that have higher, or school districts that have higher concentrations of free and reduced price school meal eligible students, or basically a larger percentage of their students come from families that have household incomes that are below or near to the federal poverty guidelines. There would be additional funding on a per pupil basis for eligible pupils to those school districts. This is structured similarly to some of the one-time funding that we see, one-time aid to school districts that we see in state fiscal year 2021 in the current state budget. And this $17.5 million per year is a total $35 million appropriation, and that's appropriated to a special account in state fiscal year 2021. So it doesn't draw from the Education Trust Fund like the rest of the adequate education grants do in 2022 and 2023. The state fiscal year 2021 budget, so the current budget that we're in, does boost education funding on a per pupil basis based on districts that have less taxable property wealth per student, so a smaller local property tax base to support their local schools. That totaled about $47.5 million in state fiscal year 2021. That would not continue under the Senate's version of the state budget. So that $47.5 million would truly just be one time if the Senate's budget becomes the next version of the state budget. The Senate's budget does include a provision that would hold enrollment at the higher of either pre-pandemic or pandemic enrollment levels for school districts for the basis or for the purpose of per pupil funding. So this would basically allow districts that saw a large decline in per pupil enrollment in the district to receive the same amount of funding as they would have if they had the pre-pandemic enrollment numbers. And it does add approximately $29 million for state fiscal year 2022. There is also a provision that allows enrollment for free and reduced price school meal eligibility specifically to be held constant through 2023. And that's only if, however, if the federal government continues a waiver program that changes the steps for determining eligibility for the free and reduced price school meal programs. And The Senate also altered the appropriations that the House made for school building aid. The House had set aside a certain amount of funding for faster debt relief associated with prior school building projects. The Senate made it a simple $30 million appropriation to the school building aid formula without targeting any for debt relief. And it is a slightly larger appropriation as well. And that is funded with state fiscal year 2021 surplus dollars through the trailer bill. And the Senate also removed the $50 million cap in terms of the amount of money that can be spent in a single year for aid to the school through the school building formula. That's removed for the biennium. I should also note there's a provision that requires the state to adjust funding if necessary to comply with the maintenance of efforts and maintenance of equity requirements for education funding that are part of the Federal American Rescue Plan Act as well, and the receipt of education-related funds. We'll talk a little bit more about those education-related funds later. Now, when we're talking about adequate education grants, it's important to remember that because so much of it is on a per pupil basis, but there are also adjustments per pupil, it's helpful for us to see what those adjustments are when we're comparing what the Senate's budget would do relative to the current state budget. So if you look all the way over on the left, you can see the base amount of per pupil aid. So this is a full-time student in a school district. That school district would receive about $3,700, or this year, this state fiscal year, I should say, that school district received $3,709 for that student as a base amount to provide them with an education from the state, I should say. If you look at the middle column, you can see there are additions for certain students based on certain characteristics. So that small green bar you can see above the larger light green, looking at the small green bar that's at the top of that middle column. That's additional aid for students that are identified as English language learners. There's additional aid in that darker orange bar that you can see across the three bars to the right. That's additional aid for free and reduced price school meal eligible students. You can see students that are receiving special education assistance. That light blue bar is additional aid for those students as well. And if a student doesn't qualify for any of those three categories that are included in the education funding formula, you can see in the second bar, you can see there's additional aid that could be provided depending on what their third grade reading score is. If they scored below proficient, then the school districts receive a little bit more for those to help educate those students. Now, if you look at that fourth bar, you can see the one-time aid associated with State Fiscal Years 2021's education funding add-ons to the formula, if you will. So there's the base level, there's the base amount in the formula and the full amount that a student could receive. There's additional amounts beyond that for fiscal capacity disparity, which is that targeting of dollars to students to help fund students that are in school districts where there's a smaller property tax base on a per student basis. So that fiscal capacity disparity aid was on a sliding scale of up to $1,750 per pupil. That would not continue under the Senate's budget proposal. That orange piece would not continue in the Senate's budget proposal. You can see the smaller piece in blue is also a sliding scale that's based on that free and reduced price school meal eligibility concentration, meaning the higher percentage of the students, the larger the amount of aid, up to $350 per eligible student. That would be altered by that specific provision wouldn't be kept, but a similar provision would be established. It's somewhat altered, but similar provision would be established by the Senate's budget proposal. It would be called relief funding. And that would be an additional up to $600 per student. But it's the total aggregate amount statewide is capped at that $17.5 million per year. So it may not be up to reach the $600 per student, depending again on the aggregate eligibility. So that's an explanation on a per pupil basis of how funding would change between state fiscal year 2021 and state fiscal year 2022. So what does that look like in aggregate? What are the overall changes that we see in terms of dollars in education funding? Well, if you look all the way over on the left, you can see that adequate education aid amount. And again, part of this is driven by enrollment, and part of this is driven by the changes and relative to the one-time policies that were in the state fiscal year 2021 budget. So what we see here is the current state budget amounts are the $0 amounts for state fiscal years 2020 and 2021, the current state budget as enacted, comparing those amounts to the 2021 session state budget proposals. So the state budget proposals for state fiscal years 2022 and 2023, That came from the governor, which you can see that the changes in green, the House, you can see those changes in orange, and the Senate, you can see those changes in blue. And overall, all the way over on the left, in adequate education aid, again, the enrollment figures factor in there, as well as the additional aid in state fiscal year 2021 that would not continue for 2022. You can see the reduction in the Senate was smaller than the reduction in the House. That reduction in the Senate is smaller, and in the governor's office, pardon me. That reduction is smaller relative to the House and the governor because the Senate added those additional provisions that allow districts to use the overall enrollment figures from pre-pandemic levels for their per pupil funding. There's also, if you look in the next column, there's the additional relief funding, that positive side of the ledger blue bar that the Senate added as well. So that's that $35 million over the course of the biennium. The Senate did add school building aid as well, a little bit more than the House. There wasn't a change relative to the House in tuition and transportation aid or relative to the last budget, and there wasn't a change relative to the House in special education aid, charter school tuition, or the public school infrastructure fund. Both the House and the Senate proposed lower amounts than the governor had proposed for that fund. Now, there was a significant policy change relative to education funding that was included in the Senate's version of the budget and was not included in the House's. And that's what's been identified in the proposed statute as education freedom accounts. And what these would do is they would permit parents to, if they disenroll their children from public school districts and apply for an education freedom account, it would allow those parents to receive the adequate education aid amount that would have gone to the school district to help educate that child, to receive that funding in one of these education freedom accounts. And that would be, those funds could be used to support that student with education related expenses. So those dollars could be deployed out of that account. Those education related expenses could include tuition and fees at private schools, both computer hardware and internet services that would be primarily used for education, and tutoring, textbooks, certain therapeutic services, school uniforms, and other expenses that have been approved by an authorized scholarship organization. Now, to be eligible, students must be a resident, a New Hampshire resident, and be eligible for public school, and they must be from a household with income with an annual income below 300% or at or below 300% of the federal poverty guidelines at the time of application. So if it rises in subsequent years, they would still be permitted to receive these dollars into an education freedom account. But at the time of application, they have to be below 300% or at or below 300% of the federal poverty guidelines, excuse me. And the cost for this is difficult to project because it depends on how many families that are currently homeschooling or currently attending private school apply for an education freedom account to receive these dollars in one of those accounts. And how many students who are currently enrolled in public schools would then be take advantage of the education freedom account program and disenroll from public schools as a result. Those are difficult numbers to project. The Department of Education has assumed a relatively modest amount of students, a relatively modest number of students would opt for this, and their families would opt for this during the biennium. So their cost projection is a little bit less than $3.5 million over the course of the biennium. The school districts, and part of that cost is that school districts would receive some transition funding associated with, for example, losing a student who enrolled in one of these education freedom accounts. The school districts would receive 50% of the amount that they would have received for that student in the prior year in the next year after that student had left, and 25% in the next year after that. There is no additional aid, however, in the subsequent years that would go to those school districts. And students that disenroll and opt for an education freedom account after July 1st of 2026, for those students, there would be no transition funding for school districts associated with that. Now, the one change that the House made that the Senate retained that is a complex change, so I want to spend a little bit of time on it here, is a reduction to the statewide education property tax, and a very significant reduction to the statewide education property tax. So the statewide education property tax is based on the statewide assessed property value that the Department of Revenue Administration re-estimates each year. It is a state tax. However, all the revenue is raised locally by local governments and retained locally. the dollars don't actually flow to the state. Even for communities that raise more than the state's obligation to pay for an adequate education in those communities, the dollars do not flow to the state. What happens is those dollars that are raised locally by the statewide education property tax are used to offset the state's obligation to pay for local public education. So there's an amount based on that adequate education formula where what we saw earlier in the bar charts. And the statewide education property tax raises a certain amount locally, and then that amount is subtracted from whatever the obligation is that the state has to pay for local public education through the adequate education grants. And then the state pays the remainder. And again, for some communities, there is no remainder. Those communities will keep the amount that they raised to the statewide education property tax. Now, the statewide education property tax is set to raise a target of $363 million. That was set in 2005 in statute, and there was no inflation adjustment included. So that $363 million amount is the amount raised by the statewide education property tax each year. This reduces this proposal that was included by the House and retained by the Senate would reduce that amount from $363 million to $263 million for state fiscal year 2023 alone. So it would go back up to $363 million in the next year. This effectively means that more money will flow to local governments from other state revenue sources that support the education trust fund. So that includes a portion of the business profits tax, a portion of the business enterprise tax, a portion of the tobacco tax, a portion of the real estate transfer tax, a few other tax revenue sources, the utility property tax, lottery commission revenues. Those would all go to support the education trust fund to supplant these $100 million in reduced revenue. Now, one thing I do want to note as well is that a change the Senate did make is there was previously a transfer from the general fund to the education trust fund to support this change in the House's version of the budget. The Senate removed that transfer because the higher revenue estimates the Senate had erased the need, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Now, there were some other education policy changes as well. One is that the governor had proposed a merger of the university system and the community college system in his budget proposal. The House had retained the potential deadline for a merger, but established a commission to study whether it was the best idea or not, and whether it should be implemented. The Senate removed both the commission and the requirement for the merger between the university and community college systems, so the Senate budget does not appear to envision any sort of merger between those two systems. The Senate would also transfer authority over the dual and concurrent enrollment program from the Department of Education to the community college system and appropriate $3 million for the program during the biennium. And the Senate added $6 million in state fiscal year 2021 surplus dollars to the governor's scholarship program, which is in addition to what the House added, and does not change the House's transferring of control of the program to the New Hampshire College Tuition Savings Plan Advisory Commission. And the Senate also made a separate appropriation of $3 million to the Department of Education for a state student data collection and reporting system. Now, we've moved on from the largest two slices of the pie in terms of the 6 categories of expenditure areas in the state budget. Let's talk about the other categories, and let's talk about the other policies that are included in the state budget as well. So as a reminder, health and social services and education we've covered. Justice and public protection includes the Department of Safety, the Department of Corrections, the Justice Department are all included in that next largest slice. Transportation is the Department of Transportation. Resource protection and development includes agencies that are focused on both economic development and environmental protection and preserving environmental areas of wilderness. And general government includes the Department of Administrative Services, the Department of Revenue Administration, some other state agencies, and the Department of Treasury as well, the State Treasury Department. Now, how did funding change in these separate categories? So here you can see the current state budget for state fiscal year 2020, for state fiscal years 2020 and 2021, including state fiscal year 2019 surplus appropriations that were established in House Bills 3 and 4 from the last budget cycle. That's compared to the 2021 session state budget proposals in state fiscal years, appropriating the surplus from state fiscal year 2021, as well as the 2022 and 23 operating budget appropriations. So you can see here again, relative to the current budget, which the baseline there is 0, the governor's changes by category are in green, the House's changes are in orange, and the Senate's changes are in blue. You can see starting with education, second to the left, the Senate amount is still a little bit lower in that education category than we see in the current state budget, but is much closer to it than we saw in the governor's and the House's proposals. Transportation gets to about the same level that we see in the current state budget. Resource protection and development is also an increase relative to the House, as is justice and public protection. And then health and social services is still a decrease in these budgeted amounts relative to the governor's proposal, but is an increase relative to the House. Now, if you look all the way over on the left, you could see the only area where there was a decrease was in general government. And that general government decrease on the Senate side is quite significant. Now, let's dig a little bit further and see what the changes are by state agency between the House's version of the state budget and the Senate's version of the state budget. So this is just comparing the House's proposal from early April to the Senate's proposal from Thursday of last week. And this is only for the state agencies that saw changes. So not every state agency is on here. It's just the ones where there was a change in appropriations between the House and the Senate's versions. So if you look all the way over on the right, you can see that there were increases at the Department of Health and Human Services, at the Department of Education, at the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, which I've included in here because of that $25 million appropriation to the Affordable Housing Fund. The Department of Environmental Services, Department of Safety, Department of Transportation, we see increases there as well on the right end of the graph. If you look all the way across, you can see that most of the changes at the other agencies are relatively small, at least in aggregate dollar terms. But if you look on the left, you can see there was a large decrease at the Treasury Department of about $150 million at the Treasury Department. So that's that decrease that we see in the general government category. And what is that decrease? Well, that decrease is largely driven by the grants that are under the purview of the Treasury Department for municipal aid. So let's talk a little bit about non-education aid to local government, specifically to municipalities in this case. The statute as it's currently written requires the 40% of the meals and rentals tax revenue that's collected by the state to go to municipalities on a per capita basis. However, it is not at that level. It's been about half that level in recent years. There is a catch-up formula that is designed to get the state back to that level, back to that 40%, or at least closer to that 40% on a year-over-year basis. The Senate would change that 40% pledge to 30%, but then it would remove the catch-up formula and meet that 30% pledge immediately. And that would result in an increase of approximately, relative to the House version and the governor's version of the budget, a little more than $35 million more from meals and rentals tax revenues going to cities and towns. And relative to the current budget, it'd be a little bit more than $50 million more, again, going through this mechanism to cities and towns through the meals and rentals tax. So the current state budget had $40 million in one-time grants that were allocated based on a different formula. This budget would not repeat those $40 million in one-time grants, but would have an additional, again, roughly close to $50 million more than the prior budget through meals and rentals tax revenues distributions. So those are administered by the Treasury Department. However, one thing the Senate did was moved those dollars to a dedicated fund that was then moved off budget entirely. So that's the equivalent then of what would have been $188 million appropriated in the state budget based on both what was the pre-existing amount for the meals and rentals tax and the increase. Those would be moved entirely off the budget and then do not show up in the Treasury Department's budget any longer. So that was a key change from the House version to the Senate version in terms of those aggregate funding levels. Separately, however, there were appropriations in terms of municipal aid for a little bit more than $15.5 million for payments for existing state aid grants from the Department of Environmental Services, largely around water and wastewater projects. And there's an increase in highway block grant aid because of higher highway fund revenue estimates as well. And while we're talking about highways, let's talk about transportation funding a little bit in the state budget. One of the key things the state budget did to support transportation funding was moving, it's a little bit indirect, but is moving $50 million in appropriations from the general fund, which has recovered more from the pandemic or more robustly from the pandemic, to the highway fund, which has not recovered as strongly from the pandemic as well, because of the different mixes of revenue sources. So that's a $50 million appropriation in the first fiscal year of the budget. The House had also appropriated $19 million in general funds to the Department of Transportation for specific purposes. The Senate reduced that to $11 million, specifically removing an apportionment distribution and also removing some funding dedicated to winter maintenance. However, the Senate did add in $5 million more to allow the Department of Transportation to leverage more federal discretionary grants. I believe this is related to the federal Department of Transportation changing how it views toll credits and the use of toll credits for matching funds. And there's also a $7 million appropriation made to the Department of Transportation to pay the federal government back for federal funds that had been previously drawn down for the Conway Bypass project, which has now been abandoned. And there's a $3.25 million allocation specifically to repair close to 2 miles of roads and road in Caleb Hill Road in Tilton. And there's the removal of toll booths in Merrimack, specifically exit 10 on the Everett Turnpike. Now, there are other changes that have been included in the state budget, both related to finances and not related to finances. One change is that the Senate voted to that all classified full-time positions in the state that were vacant prior to July 1st of 2018 and remained vacant or would remain vacant as of July 1st of 2021 would be abolished. There are pay raises for certain groups of state employees that are included, but not all state employees, based on what I understand. There's also a restoration of the Liquor Commission's law enforcement authority, which the House had removed, and 20 positions were also added back to the Liquor Commission associated with that law enforcement authority. There's a $10 million appropriation to help people who suffered financially due to financial resources mortgage misdeeds that were done several years ago. There's a $2.2 million appropriation to travel and tourism development efforts in 2 separate budget lines at the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. There's 2 funds that have been established and likely would accept federal COVID-19 related relief funds, one to support very small businesses and one to support public venues as well. The House had proposed adding in limits on the governor's emergency powers into the state budget. The Senate removed that language, and the understanding, at least among the discussion that the senators had, was that those would be dealt with in a separate bill. The changes to the governor's emergency powers would be dealt with in a separate piece of legislation. And the Senate's budget would also narrow the House's proposed prohibitions on certain discussions related to systemic racism and sexism. This has commonly been called the divisive concepts language during this legislative session. The House's language would have prevented entities that contract with the state from having trainings that included certain types of discussions on a list of topics, including racism and sexism. The Senate removed that requirement for contracted entities and revised the language and proposed inserting it into the state's anti-discrimination statutes. The Senate's proposal would forbid public employers, government programs, and school districts from teaching that an individual, by virtue of his or her age, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, creed, color, or certain other characteristics, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. So now let's talk about the revenue side, specifically how much revenue did the Senate project that the state would collect during the budget biennium under current law, and what were the changes to that law that what were the changes to those laws that would affect revenues? So the Senate projected substantially more revenue than the House did. So here you can see the governor's projections for state fiscal years 2021 through 2023 in green, the House's in orange, and the Senate's in blue. Note again that the axis does not begin at 0 on the vertical side of the graph, and that I've included state fiscal year 2021 here because that's important for understanding how many surplus dollars are available that can be then used to support operations in the subsequent budget biennium should policymakers decide to do so. And In total, the Senate in the general and education trust funds projected there would be about $500 million more in revenue than the House. So that's a significant change. And it's worth noting that the general and education trust funds, again, aren't the entire state budget. The general fund is about a quarter, and the education trust fund is another about 16% of the state budget. Federal funds are about 30% and play an important role there. Many of those dollars are matched with general funds to be drawn from the federal government. So, so it's not the entire state budget when we say $500 million more in revenue, but it's a significant portion of the state budget that sees that much more revenue. And that, of course, affects, for example, federal matching funds. So what did the Senate propose? The Senate retained many of the tax rate changes, or all the tax rate changes that were proposed by the House, and did make 2 significant modifications as well as a couple other tweaks. So the Senate voted to retain the proposal that would reduce the meals and rentals tax from 9% to 8.5%, that would reduce the business profits tax from 7.7% to 7.6%, would reduce the business enterprise tax rate from 0.6% to 0.55%, and also raise the filing threshold so that very small businesses would be less likely to file or to have to file. The Senate also retained the proposal to eliminate the interest and dividends tax over 5 years, starting in 2023, so starting toward the end of the budget biennium. The Senate also voted to limit the amount of tax credit carry forwards that businesses can keep with the state. Currently, the state has a large amount of taxes that are tax credits that were collected from overpaid business taxes. Businesses paid more than they needed to, and as opposed to asking for those credits in a refund, kept them with the state to help offset future liabilities. Because there is a large amount being carried with the state now, the governor's proposal and the House's proposal in different ways would limit that carry forward. The Senate's proposal would as well, in the same way as the House. However, it also adds a study commission to see the best way to manage this credit carry forward going forward. As we discussed, the Senate would also lower the statewide education property tax for state fiscal year 2023 only, and permit wagering on historic horse races. So these are horse races that have already happened, would be allowed to be bet on. There is a tweak to the timing in terms of which facilities are eligible to have historic horse racing at their locations. There were 2 modifications that the Senate made to the House version of the budget that substantially affected revenue. One is making the Paycheck Protection Program aid. These were loans from the federal governments that came to businesses that were in many cases turned into grants. Those grants are currently counted as income under the state's business profits tax statute. So that income would then be considered taxable if the business made a profit with that income. The Senate's changes would make those dollars in income not count towards that profitability calculation. So businesses that made a profit during the pandemic but received loans that were turned into grants would not have to count those dollars as taxable under the business profits tax, which would likely reduce the amount which they were considered profitable, that threshold for considered profitable for being profitable. And that's estimated to be about a $69.4 million reduction in revenue during the biennium. There's also the House had voted to delay a change in apportionment. So this is how a multi-state business determines its tax liability, specifically to New Hampshire. The House voted to delay that change to that form of apportionment. The Senate voted to keep it on its original schedule, so accelerate it relative to the House, and that would reduce the revenues by about $20 million. Now, the interest and dividends tax, I want to talk about this a little bit. This is a repeal that would be phased in over 5 years, but this analysis from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy shows that if it were to be eliminated today based on 2019 incomes, that the lowest 20% of income earners, whether they're paying this tax or not, the lowest 20% of income earners would, which are folks making less than $31,000 a year or averaging about $19,000 a year, on average, they would see a $2 reduction in their tax liability across the lowest 20% of income earners, whether they're paying this tax or not. If we look to the middle income earners, then we're talking about an average of dozens of dollars, or a dozen or dozens of dollars reduction in tax liability. If we go all the way to the other end of the income spectrum, so for folks who are making more than $595,000 a year or averaging $1.8 million roughly a year, then the tax reduction, the tax liability reduction they would see were the interest and dividends tax to be eliminated would be about $7,500 per year. So a substantially larger amount for higher income individuals than for lower income individuals. Relative to the business profits tax, it's important to remember that large entities are particularly important in the business profits tax base in New Hampshire. So they comprise a lot of those of who the taxpayers are in terms of the dollars paid. So, for example, in tax year 2018, which is the most recent year for which we have these data broken down, there were 76 business entities that filed that paid almost half of the business profits tax that was collected, or the total business profits tax revenue that was collected during that year. So again, the tax liability falls largely on large entities. And we know from another breakdown of the business profits tax that so-called Water's Edge filers, which comprised about 5% of all filers, so only 1 in 20 of all filers during tax year 2018. These tend to be entities that have a significant overseas component. They tend to be large multi-state, multinational entities that have a significant overseas component, I should say. They paid more than $6 in $10 that came into the business profits tax, in business profits tax revenue. So these are significant. This is where a significant amount of the incidence of the business profits tax is on these larger entities. So let's compare the top line numbers, right? We just talked about all the things that or many of the things that the Senate budget changed relative to the House budget. And we talked about the revenue differences. What does that mean in terms of the actual amount that's appropriated by the Senate budget versus the House budget? Well, if we look at the total levels, then we can see, if you can see the current state budget all the way over in blue. This is just looking at, I should also say, this is just looking at the bottom line of the 700 or so pages, 715 pages or so of line item appropriations. So this isn't including House Bill 2 appropriations. This is including changes in the back of the budget in House Bill 1. And you may have heard, and based on these figures, you've heard correctly that the Senate budget spends a smaller amount of dollars than the House budget. You can see the current state budget all the way over on the left in the dark blue, the governor's proposed budget in green, the House's proposal in orange, and the Senate's budget in blue, which again, based on those bottom line numbers, is a smaller amount. However, how can this be if we've already been talking about all the things the Senate has added relative to the House budget proposal? And the Senate had higher revenue estimates in the general and education trust funds of $501.4 million across the 3 state fiscal years. And again, those surplus dollars in state fiscal year 2021 can and were used by the Senate to support state budget operations and other operations in their proposed House Bill 1 and House Bill 2. The Senate did vote to reduce revenues relative to the House budget by about $89.4 million with those 2 additional changes in business taxes. And so maybe there's some left in savings. The Senate left substantially more in savings than the House, and that might be the answer. Well, the House would add about just shy of $35 million to the rainy day fund and wouldn't have an education trust fund surplus. The Senate would also add just shy of $35 million to the education trust fund and would have a surplus in the in the rainy day fund, and would have a surplus in the education trust fund of $23.7 million. So there's a positive balance there that the House doesn't have. But all that accounts for about $113.1 million of the $501.4 million in general and education trust funds revenue increases. And that's, again, not including other parts of the budget. So where is the remaining $338 million, and how is the Senate budget smaller? Well, that's because if you include the Senate's appropriated funds in state fiscal year 2021 and the funds that have been moved to House Bill 2 or entirely off budget, so not included in House Bill 1 or House Bill 2, but have been appropriated and established elsewhere by policy language in House Bill 2, then the Senate's budget actually appropriates, in terms of what's in House Bill 1 and House Bill 2, would actually appropriate significantly more expenditures over the course of the budget biennium. So here, making those adjustments to all 4 of these categories, you can see the current state budget all the way over on the left, the governor's proposal and the House's proposal in green and orange, respectively, and the Senate's proposal in blue, with the pieces that have been moved off budget in gray and that darker orange. So the governor and the House did make appropriations in House Bill 2, the governor to a much smaller extent than the House. The Senate made significant appropriations in House Bill 2, including State Fiscal Year 2021 appropriations, and moved that $188 million in state aid to municipalities entirely off the budget and into a separate dedicated fund that wasn't counted in the budget. There are also about $30 million in federal funds that may be accepted in full or in part later, we're not certain, by the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee during the budget biennium that the Senate moved as well. One thing the Senate didn't do, however, was include in its budget explicitly appropriations of flexible federal funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. Now, the Senate budget writers did include that in their discussions and their considerations, but they didn't explicitly include American Rescue Plan Act funds in the Senate version of the budget. Now, the American Rescue Plan Act does a wide variety of things. It's a very significant piece of legislation. And if you want to learn more about it, we have 2 blogs on our website that focus on the American Rescue Plan Act. On May 19th, we also had a webinar talking about federal aid and the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Here, I'm going to focus on just the flexible funds and what it might mean for state finances and local government finances in the state. So there's a significant amount of dollars coming to the state of New Hampshire, expected or arriving in the state of New Hampshire as a result of the American Rescue Plan Act. About $353 million to K-12 schools in New Hampshire, focused on reopening safely and addressing pandemic learning loss. There's a one-time allocation to the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families funds that the state receives from the federal government. There's also enhanced funding for home and community-based services through Medicaid that's in place for a 1-year period, and those funds have to be used in addition to the federal and state funds that are budgeted. They can't be used to supplant state funds. There's also a capital projects fund, which is really focused on broadband, but can also be used for capital assets that are important to communities otherwise. There's a state small business credit initiative, and the largest appropriation, the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, which combined to state and local governments in New Hampshire are about $1.457 billion coming to New Hampshire. And here's the rough breakdown of those funds and how they, where they are going in terms of the levels of government. So about 2/3 or close to $1 billion is coming to the state government over time. Again, I think these are funds that are appropriated in 2 tranches. There's more than $250 million going to county governments in New Hampshire, going to the 10 counties, and then to cities and towns in total in New Hampshire, or to local governments that are generally cities and towns in New Hampshire. There's about close to $200 million combined. There are some that's set aside for specific metropolitan cities, identified in part through a community development block grant related formula, and then there's other cities and towns will receive the balance of the funding. So what can these dollars be used for? Well, there's considerable flexibility in the Treasury Department's guidance thus far, which is not final, but the guidance thus far does suggest that there's going to be quite a bit of flexibility for local governments and for state governments to use these funds. And because of that flexibility, community engagement is urged by the Treasury Department, to the U.S. Treasury Department, to determine what the best uses are. They've identified that supporting the response to the pandemic and supporting vital public services and jobs that have been affected by the pandemic are key uses of these funds. Also addressing the health disparities that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. And that might include behavioral and mental health services and aid for related to substance misuse as well. And using these dollars for the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis is also something the Treasury Department highlighted, including aid to impacted workers, households, families, small businesses, nonprofits, and particularly to impacted industries. And the Treasury Department suggests that the travel, tourism, leisure, and hospitality may be included in those. And specifically, because there are so many new services and so many people who may be newly in need of services, there's an encouragement to use these funds for outreach and for helping people access services. So for navigators and for people to assist other people in connecting them to services. There's also premium pay, including pay that's either retrospective or retroactive pay for work done during the pandemic for essential workers. There are some permitted uses under there, as well as certain housing services, including lead paint remediation, and a little bit more generally affordable housing development for certain underserved census tract areas. Broadband infrastructure is permitted to be used to use these dollars for, as well as a wide array of water and sewer infrastructure purposes. And the Treasury Department emphasizes that the help has to go to those who've been the most impacted by the crisis, or the help should go to those who are the most impacted by the crisis, in an effort to make these long-term investments that foster health and economic benefits over a long period of time. And part of that would be addressing the systemic health and economic challenges that cause the particularly unequal impacts that we saw from the COVID-19 crisis on people and groups in the United States in particular. Now, causing those unequal impacts, pardon me. There are certain limitations on the use of these funds. For example, they cannot be used directly or indirectly to offset net state tax reductions. Now, this is based, the Treasury Department set up the formula for determining whether these funds would be used to directly or indirectly offset state tax revenue reductions based on the state fiscal year 2019 tax revenues in a state, and then adjusting for inflation. So if revenues are outpacing inflation, then there could be tax revenue reductions above the, as long as the total tax revenues would stay above that inflation adjusted amount relative to, again, state fiscal year 2019. Or if there's a specific expenditure reduction that's associated with those tax reductions, as long as the department where there are those expenditure reductions is not one that has also received these flexible funds, because that could be seen as offsetting the tax reductions, the reduction in tax revenue for the department. But it does, because of that inflation adjustment baseline, it does prevent there to be substantial reductions in taxes that are then directly or even through departments indirectly paid for by these federal funds. These funds can also not be deposited into pension funds or rainy day funds. They can't be used to boost the unemployment compensation fund at the state level to pre-pandemic levels. They can't be used to pay interest or principal on existing debt, or these federal funds can't be used to match other federal funds, such as in Medicaid. So they can't be used to supplant general fund dollars that would match Medicaid dollars. They generally can't be used to support governmental pandemic responses from before March of this year, and they can't be used for really non-specific, non-pandemic related economic or workforce development, although in certain communities that are disproportionately impacted, they can be used for somewhat more general purposes. And the costs must be incurred or obligated by the end of 2024 and expended by the end of 2026, which leaves a little bit more time for some of those capital projects as well. We don't know yet how we've distributed for certain, at least I don't know yet at this point. During the state Senate budget discussions, some senators indicated that the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee would play a role, but to my understanding, it's not been finalized yet exactly how these funds would be distributed and the purposes determined. So in summary, the Senate did restore some of the funding to health and social services that had been removed in the House's proposal. Education funding does receive a significant boost as well relative to the House, but it's still slightly less overall and less targeted than is in the current state budget. There's more support that's been directed at housing, transportation, and long-term care services. The tax changes that are included in the state Senate's version of the budget do increase the risk of insufficient funds for future services. And looking to future services, both in the next state budget and the one after, or in subsequent ones, it's important to remember that this next state budget comes at a critical time in the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, where both the health and economic needs of Granite Staters are likely to be higher earlier in the bienniums. There would be a larger need for services earlier in the biennium. And this recession has impacted those with the fewest resources most severely, and the next state budget can help build an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. Now, the next steps, in 2 days, there has to be a committee of conference formed if a committee of conference is going to form around the state budget. And the deadline then for the committee of conference's final agreement is on June 17th, so a week and 2 days away. The last day for the House and the Senate to pass the final version of the budget, or what might be the final version of the budget that might come out of a committee of conference were it to happen, would be June 24th. And the governor must sign, or to permit to become law without his signature, some form of new spending authority by the end of state fiscal year 2021, which is June 30th of 2021. And the new state fiscal year begins the next day. And then the American Rescue Plan Act funding, we don't know the timeline yet at this point as to how those funds will be deployed, but it's a substantial amount of resources that could be deployed for services and projects in New Hampshire. With that, again, you can contact us and follow us on social media using the information on this slide. And as a reminder, this slide deck is already posted on our website, and I believe the link to that is in the chat for this webinar. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and invite my colleague, Michael Palazzati, to facilitate the question and answer section for this webinar. So Michael, over to you.
Great, thanks, Phil. Thanks for the great presentation. It was very informative. So I've been keeping an eye on the questions in the background as they've been coming in. And I'd also like to remind the audience that you can continue to ask questions using the question and answer function, and we'll try to get to them. So with that, the first question has to do with the stabilization grants. So what happens with the stabilization grants and education aid in the Senate's budget proposal?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The stabilization grants, so what stabilization grants are, for those who aren't familiar, is when the education funding formula changed between the state fiscal year 2011 and state fiscal year 2012 budgets. There was a change to the education funding formula in that time period between those 2 years. And there were some communities that would have received less funding as a result of that change to the education funding formula, particularly property poor communities were disproportionately represented in those communities that would lose funding. So stabilization grants are the amount of difference between that 2011 amount of funding that they would have received in the 2011 funding formula and the 2012 funding formula. So basically holding those communities harmless. Those dollars are the same amount of dollars that were that drop off, that would have been that drop off. And those same amount of dollars have been carried forward every year in what are called stabilization grants or stabilization aid. And those are baked in to the adequate education aid that's in the state, that's listed in the adequate education aid line in the state budget. So it's not included separately. There was a reduction over time, over 3 fiscal years in 2017 to 2019, in the amount of stabilization aid, stabilization grants that were received. They were declining at 4% a year. The last state budget set them back to their original amounts and set them in statute. So they are still their original amounts, and the Senate version of the budget does not envision changing those amounts. So those stabilization grant amounts are the same in the Senate's version of the budget as they were, for example, back when they were first established in 2012. The Senate didn't change them here.
Okay, great, thanks. So shifting a little bit to SWEPT now. So we had a question come in that asks, what happens if the projected revenues aren't met and a school district isn't able to meet their education obligations?
Right. So for a school district, I can't speak specifically to a school district, but if the projected revenues that are put together in the state budget are not met, specifically in the education trust fund, if there's a shortfall in the education trust fund, so let's say there are more students than expected, or the education freedom accounts cost more than were originally expected and are drawing from the education trust fund, or if revenues fall, right? So if both those things happen, then if the education trust fund has a shortfall, then it draws money automatically from the general fund to fill that shortfall. If there's a shortfall in both the education trust fund and the general fund, then what happens is that the education trust fund is supported by the general fund, but the general fund then has a larger deficit at the end of the next budget biennium. And as we saw in this budget, a significant amount of surplus dollars were deployed to support services over the next 2 years from the state fiscal year 2021 surplus. If we have a deficit at the end of state fiscal year 2023, then not only are those surplus dollars not available to carry forward in the next budget, but the next budget will then have to resolve that deficit that's carried forward, because the state budget as passed has to be a balanced plan, meaning that whatever surplus or deficit is carried forward into the next state budget is included in the calculations of, does the state budget balance at the end of the budget biennium as projected at the time of the state budget's passage. I hope that answered the question, but that's the basic upshot.
Great, thanks. And now shifting a little bit, but still staying on the topic of education to an extent. So could you talk a little bit more about the additional free and reduced price school meal aid proposed by the Senate and how it's different from the current formula?
Yes, so the current formula, so there is in the adequate education aid funding formula as it was prior to the last budget, for example, as you saw in the bar charts, there's a certain amount of dollars that's appropriated on a per pupil basis for students who are eligible for free and reduced price school meals and to fund their education. Again, these dollars don't go to the students, they go to the public school district. So that additional aid was already in the formula. In state fiscal year 2021, what we saw as a result of the current state budget as passed is a sliding scale that starts that adds aid for municipalities, I should say, that have resident students that are free and reduced price school lunch eligible, that increases the amount of aid as a larger and larger percentage of the students are eligible. So under the current formula, for communities that have less than 12% of their students eligible, there's no additional aid. For communities that have between 12 and 48%, there's additional aid between $87.50 at that 12% or just beyond 12% level, all the way up to $350 for those communities that have 48% of their students eligible for free and reduced price school meals. So again, from low income families. Then for communities that are higher than 48%, it's a $350 appropriation. That's what happened this year. The Senate's proposal for relief funding would appropriate on that same 12% to 48%, have that same sliding scale, start at $150 per student for eligible free and reduced price school meal student, in addition to the existing formula, the baseline formula, not the sliding scale in the last budget. Would be an additional $150 and go up to an additional $600 at 48%, and then be capped at $600. Now, it may never reach $600 because there is a cap based on the aggregate amount, based on that $17.5 million a year. And again, this is just an appropriation that's in a special account for relief funding, so it's not being drawn from the Education Trust Fund. It's already sort of set aside and then not included in the fiscal years 22 and 23 budget. That appropriation would fund that, again, sliding scale that goes up to that higher amount for districts and the new one is specifically around school districts that have almost half of their students eligible for free and reduced price school meals, again, from low income families or more. So I hope that helped.
It does. Great. So, and then the next question has to do with, let's see, childcare. So you mentioned some childcare funding in the state budget. The governor's proposal had funded employment-related childcare at lower levels. So where does that stand now?
Right. So my understanding of where that stands, so when the governor introduced his budget proposal, there was a substantial reduction in the amount of funding that would be in employment, childcare related to employment. So employment enabling childcare services. And this is a really high level description, I should say. There are a lot of details here that do matter, but that I won't get into. So there's a reduction in childcare overall in that funding line. However, what the House did is they added a provision that would enable if to prevent a waiting list for that particular employment-related childcare service for those funds to help families access childcare. If there's a waiting list that is developed, then the Department of Health and Human Services could go request funding. And that funding would then come from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, the block grant that comes to the state each year from the federal government. So that funding would then support that child care assistance. The Senate left those funding levels intact. They did add funding for child care for the other purposes. You saw that related to children that are in what are now closed Division of Children, Youth, and Families cases. So that's a separate appropriation. My understanding, anyway, is a separate appropriation. The funding level, so the funding levels in that line are the same, based on my knowledge, but the Senate did amend the language that helps prevent a wait list from forming, by saying that general funds could not be drawn upon to support the elimination or reduction of a wait list if a wait list develops. So that's something the Senate did change. I can't speak to any other particular changes, but that is a provision that the Senate changed relative to that. What was initially and still is, to my knowledge, lower levels of child care funding. Again, the Senate did add a little bit of funding for that. My understanding is for that specific purpose around former DCYF case childcare.
Great. And then shifting a little bit, so could you explain a bit more about which funds were moved out of the budget, particularly the $188 million? So that's been moved to a dedicated off-budget fund, and is that to be used to pay the meals and rooms sharing to towns over the upcoming biennium?
Yes, so that 188.2 million is the estimated amount that would go to municipalities on a per capita basis from meals and rooms tax revenue, and that appropriation is an estimate based on going to that 30% of meals and rooms tax revenue, or meals and rentals tax, revenue, going to that level as the Senate set forth, and then moving it off the budget entirely into a dedicated fund. Now, the way the statute is set up now in terms of the language, it's unclear to me whether those meals and rentals tax revenues should have actually been going to the general fund in the first place. But the general fund, historically in state budgets, the general fund appropriation for those distributions to cities and towns has been made in the state budget. So the state budget includes, as you saw on the pie chart, there's the general fund, there's the education trust fund, there's federal funds, there's the highway fund, turnpike fund, there's also this category of other funds. And the interesting thing about this move is that it sets aside those meals and rentals tax revenues into a dedicated fund. And that dedicated fund is then subsequently not included in other funds. It's moved entirely out of the budget. And that it's just a statute. That's not to say that it couldn't be moved back in or couldn't be altered or changed or diverted. It's just established by statute. But it's interesting that it has been moved entirely off the fund, which is why it affects those bar charts that we saw earlier a fair bit, because it is not counted as a general fund appropriation or an other fund appropriation in the state budget. It's completely separate.
Great. And then, so shifting again a little bit, so the merger of the university system and the community college system, it's not included in this proposal anymore. But what about the funding? Did the Senate change the funding levels at all?
Yeah, so the Senate added in, there were a couple provisions that I listed around funding for the dual and concurrent enrollment program, for example. But in terms of the general fund appropriations to the community college system and the university system relative to the House budget, I don't believe the Senate changed them. And the House put them up to the levels that were similar, indeed, I think a little bit higher than what was in the current state budget. So the House put those higher levels in their version of the state budget, and to my knowledge, the Senate did not alter them, so they should be the same.
Great, and then just briefly, so moving to the federal aid side a little bit. So what are some of the methods and processes that through which the American Rescue Plan Act's flexible dollars could be deployed in the state?
Yeah, so and as I noted, the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee may be part of this process, and that would make sense. What happens usually with the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee is state agencies will come to them with requests for funding changes. And often those requests for funding changes are a result of receiving a federal grant, right? A federal grant appears at some point during the budget biennium, and a department is alerted to that, wants to deploy those dollars, and has to go to the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee, which is made up of members of the House and Senate Finance Committees, although not all the members, to request that change to the state budget. So in that sense, this large amount of federal funding coming could be accepted by the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee. However, typically, the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee doesn't consider bills or consider appropriations itself. It just vets and approves, if it does approve, appropriations that are brought forward to them by departments. There are a couple other ways in which funding could be deployed. We saw, for example, over the last year when there's been a state of emergency in place and the governor's emergency powers appear to enable him to deploy federal funding directly that's received. As long as the governor's emergency powers are in place, the governor could potentially deploy some of these federal funds. I'm not an attorney. I'm not able to really, delineate exactly where that is and relative to where the governor's emergency powers may end at some point. So it's a little bit not as clear to me. Those funds were administered through the Governor's Office for Emergency Relief and Recovery. A similar office could be established, for example, in statute that would be administering these funds, even if not making the decisions around them. It might be collecting the information, as we saw with that office with Gopher, to deploy these funds and to collect information around deploying these funds. We could see these funds deployed through legislation. So one of the questions was, would it be included in the state budget? And could it still be included in the state budget if there's a committee of conference version? It's possible that some funds may be deployed through the state budget. They could be deployed through separate individual pieces of legislation. There could be a supplementary budget or a separate budget that's around just American Rescue Plan Act funds. So there are a number of different ways in which these dollars could be deployed, and indeed they could be deployed in all these ways over time. The governor can, under his emergency authority, direct some of those funds directly to state agencies, from what I understand. So there are a number of different ways these funds could be deployed, and those ways will probably change over time. But so I haven't heard anything definitive yet, other than knowing that the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee will be part of the process.
Great, and it looks like we have time for one more question. So just to remind the audience and everyone listening, so we know it's been laid out in the Senate's budget proposal. So could you remind us again what the next steps are?
Sure. So at this point, my understanding of the next steps is that the House will meet on the 10th. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone else knows, but the House will meet on the 10th. And should take up the concurrence or non-concurrence with the Senate's versions of House Bill 1 and House Bill 2 at that time. If they concur, then the Senate's version of the budget will have been agreed to by the House and will go to the governor's desk for consideration. If the House does not concur with the changes that the Senate made, then a committee of conference will be formed, has to be formed again on the 10th, so Thursday of this week. And that committee of conference will agree on a final version of a finalized, if you will, a potential final version of the budget by the 17th, by the next week. And then that version will go before both chambers, likely on the 24th, both before the House and the Senate, and has to pass through both chambers as is. There's no amendments on the floor at that time, on the floor of either chamber. Has to pass through both chambers as is, as an up or down vote, before then it goes to the governor to be potentially the next set of spending authority for the state that would start on July 1st.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time. So thank you again, Phil, for the presentation and for your thoughtful answer to all the questions. So with that, I'll invite Anne Marie back up onto the screen, and she'll provide us with some closing remarks and close out the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Phil, for that informative presentation. And thank you, Mike, for facilitating the question and answer segment. The next state budget will come at a critical time for New Hampshire and its residents, and it can play an important role in our efforts to build an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economic recovery. NHFBI will continue to track the state budget as the process moves forward, and will continue to publish new resources related to the state budget, as well as the American Rescue Plan Act funding that is available to help us support a broad, robust economic recovery here in New Hampshire. You'll find all of NHFBI's publications and resources related to the state budget, state revenue, the economy, and other topics online at our website at nhfpi.org. We hope that you found today's presentation to be informative. You'll receive an email later this afternoon with links to the slide deck and the video recording when that is available. We'll also be posting those links to our website, so you'll be able to access those via the budget section of our website as well. Thank you all again for joining us for today's event. Please stay safe and well and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.